What effect is the low price of milk in Europe having on African dairy farmers?
I don't know. I know milk is cheaper here than in Greece, where I'm from. Milk costs twice as much there, but I don't know about Africa. I'd say it's ruining their milk market.
African dairy farmers, how should I know?
If we're in favor of buying locally, we don't have to do the opposite and send our goods all around the world.
Milk for the calves, not for sale. Overproduction has been causing protests and is threatening small dairy farmers in Africa. In the European Union, the milk quotas are being swept away. The motto here is free trade in a free market, supported by billions of euros in subsidies for the agricultural sector. The farmers in developing countries don't stand a chance. They have no money, no high-tech and no tariffs to protect them from cheap imports. Protests against this policy fall on deaf ears. EU Agriculture Ministers' Conference, Luxembourg, October 2008. EU Commissioner Marianne Fischer-Boel is welcoming the Finnish Minister of Agriculture. This is where the decisions about liberalising the dairy market are made. Until now, the EU has limited production by setting a quota. This limitation will now be removed, little by little. The EU will be allowed to produce 1% more milk every year for the next 5 years. It is the turn of the French Agriculture Minister, Michel Barnier, to chair the conference, and as he does so, tractors are appearing outside. This liberalisation policy is angering the farmers. If more milk is produced, prices will drop. Many small and medium-sized businesses could be put out of business. A few hundred dairy farmers from France, the Benelux countries and Germany have come to Luxembourg. These countries produce more than half of the EU's 100 million tonnes of milk. The plans are to increase this figure. The dairy industry is dreaming of supplying the global market. This would be fatal for most dairy farmers. What is the cowbell for? Is it to ring the death knell of the industry?
No, it's a protest bell, an alarm bell, to say that if the Ministers of Agriculture decide against us, we will protest against them.
The farmers are urged to make so much noise that they won't go unheard. They want to make a noise and be heard. That's why they're here. But care has been taken that no one will hear them. The balance of power is clear here. The European political routine will carry on uninterrupted. The dairy farmers can do what they want. They won't get through to the politicians. They are sealed off in the conference centre. It almost seems as if the farmers are making this noise to dispel their fear of politics. 8,000 kilometres away in Africa, Zambia is home to 12 million people. 2/3 of the population earn no more than $1.25 a day. Small collective milk stations help boost earnings a bit. Laboriously erected structures on a continent that is being increasingly threatened by privation. According to the German charity Welthungerhilfe, more than 200 million Africans are malnourished, and this figure is rising. Oxfam has been publicising this problem for a long time. Rich industrialised countries, such as the EU member states, are flooding the African markets with subsidised, cheap food. This prevents Africa from being
The EU agricultural subsidy system aims at improving export production. It's paradoxical because only 10% of the total agricultural production in the EU is exported. 90% is for the domestic market. But all the money is still spent in a way that promotes export production, while sustainable agriculture and regional development are not supported, even though these things are important for the countries themselves.
Sachen für die Länder selbst wichtig wären, eben nicht entsprechend unterstützt wird.
At least critical organisations such as Oxfam aren't entirely alone anymore. European dairy farmers are getting rebellious. They have come together from 14 countries. They call themselves EMB, the European Milk Board. They want to stop the EU policy or alter it by holding press conferences, such as this one, on the day of the Agriculture Ministers' Conference in Luxembourg. Their leader, Romuald Schaber, has a drastic warning of the consequences of the EU policy.
The farmers will be driven to bankruptcy en masse, and the ones who will be left will be huge businesses like we have in the United States today.
This affects all farmers, not just European ones. Industrial, highly subsidized big companies are forcing out small farms. This is not the right way to go, according to the European Milk Board.
It is expensive for the taxpayer, and it doesn't even solve the problems. It's nothing but export dumping, just via a different route, which also puts the producers in the receiving countries under pressure and intensifies the problems. It doesn't attack them at the root.
Further overproduction, low prices and export subsidies in Europe would mean the end of dairy farmer John Mwemba from Zambia. He came to Germany to protest side by side with his German colleagues. He owns 7 dairy cows. They produce around 50 litres of milk every day for him and his family. He likes showing his photographs from his visit to Germany. Mwemba worked as a teacher for 40 years, but because his pension wasn't enough, he became a dairy farmer. He started with 1 cow and 2 litres of milk a day. Then he founded a collective together with others. Thanks to the milk, his family can survive. But if free trade came along and the EU were to implement the liberalised milk market, John Mwemba's livelihood would be threatened by cheap imported milk.
The liberalized policy on trade, especially in milk, from Europe into Zambia, particularly to Magoye, is a threat, a serious threat to us, because we know that we will close down our activity. And if that happens, we will be forced to go into poverty, and it might be very difficult to come back to where we are today.
The EU is negotiating with all African states about the abolition of import duties. Zambia is still resisting, while Zimbabwe has already given in. The problems of the people in Africa are not of great interest in Germany. Organizations like DIE, the German Development Institute, funded by the federal government, organize expert events like this one in Bonn. Most of those here are students. They get credits for their courses by attending. Despite the current problems being discussed by knowledgeable guest speakers, there is almost no public reaction, even though no less a person than the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, has come. He criticizes the World Bank's misguided policy. It has underestimated how important it would have been to invest in the agriculture of developing countries. Money was mainly poured into infrastructure, the construction of roads, bridges and wells. These failures are now showing their effects.
in a way, it's very difficult to speak of achieving a level playing field, given the differences in productivity between the European producers on one hand and the African producers on the other hand. Even if we remove the subsidies which support, for the moment, European farmers, even then they will remain highly competitive in comparison to African farmers. African farmers must be helped. There is a general agreement that there needs much more investment in African agriculture, but even so, it may take years before they are sufficiently competitive with European producers.
We're back in Zambia with 77-year-old John Mwemba. He has found a young man who does the daily milk transport for him. His daily output weighs around 50 kilograms, and it has to be transported by bicycle over 16 kilometers of dirt track. The destination is the cooperative John Mwemba co-founded. They started with 25 dairy farmers. That was in the early 90s. The farmers had realized they wouldn't be able to survive by growing maize alone, but their collective went bankrupt. They couldn't find anyone to buy their milk. But Mwemba didn't give up. He tried his luck again in 1997. This time, the Italian milk company Parmalat had just discovered Zambia as a market, and the small collective was needed as a milk supplier. The GTZ, the German Technical Cooperation Organization, gave them financial support so they were able to buy cows. Ever since then, the collective has been up and running. More than 340 farmers are now members, and they produce 3,000 litres every day. John Mwemba earns $250 a month. Parmalat is still their biggest customer. As a result, Parmalat's buyer, Martin Njobvu, is very important to the collective. A good business relationship is maintained, and everyone is satisfied with the situation. Before every meeting, they thank God for their good life. Of course, overproduction and export subsidies in the EU are worrisome for the dairy farmers. The collective is much too small to be able to survive a fully liberalised milk market. And if their biggest customer were to walk away, their fate would be sealed. Should subsidised milk find its way to the Zambian market, Parmalat would have to react.
In situations when there's a shortage, that would help in the sense that we keep that market for the supplier, in this case the farmer. But if there's too much that is coming in from outside, definitely it would affect the market, especially if other players in the market as well, like processors, are able to buy it cheaply and then offload it on the market at a cheaper price than we are paying the farmers. Because at the moment, I think Zambia is one of the best payers in terms of raw milk that we get from the suppliers.
Parmalat currently pays the farmers 40 euro cents per litre. That's a price European dairy farmers can only dream of at the moment. After a strike in spring 2008, an increase in milk prices was agreed, but now the price is back at around 30 cents a litre, and this figure is still falling. But so far the protests of the European dairy farmers have had little effect. A group of farmers have come to Brussels. They've been invited by the president of the German Farmers' Union, Gerd Sonnleitner. The EU functionaries want to garner support for their policies here. They don't give the farmers any backing for their demands.
I've known you for 10 years. You've become older, but not much wiser. Your arrogance towards dairy farmers is still there.
The consequences of the EU policies for Africa are not on the agenda here.
We haven't ruined anyone in Africa. Africa has other problems like war and civil war and no legal system and outrageous corruption and no right to property. Equating these ills with our milk policies is outrageous.
With no infrastructure or economic structures for milk production, this will lead to poverty and then maybe also to terrorism and war.
Maybe, but I want to make it absolutely clear that this is not because of European agricultural policy. Go to these African countries and see how they get in each other's way. They're not building up an infrastructure for themselves. They couldn't supply us, and we can't even get to them with our products. I don't understand the point of this question.
But here the official is wrong because one global player, the Italian company Parmalat, set up shop in Africa in the 90s. Parmalat processes 2 million litres of milk a month in Zambia alone. All that milk is exclusively for the African market. Most products like fresh milk, yogurt, cheese and butter are sold in Zambia and are also exported to neighbouring countries. This has brought about well-functioning structures that are constantly being developed. No war and no chaos, as the president of the German Farmers' Union would have us believe. The mess comes from Europe. Since March 2009, 30,000 tonnes of butter and 109,000 tonnes of low-fat milk powder are bought in the EU with taxpayers' money and dumped onto the world market. The farmers in Africa can't compete with the EU throwaway prices.
We will not just be frustrated if Parmalat is stopped or paid as half. We will actually be sort of destroyed, so to say, because we are a small emerging cooperative and dairy farming has become our prominent activity. If anybody interfered with it and or if Parmalat is stopped, we will be very much uncomfortable. We will be unable to send the children to school, we will be unable to send our sick family members. We will have, where we need to buy food, we have no means to buy the food. So we want to continue if we will be protected.
The dairy farmers' fear is justified. The experiences of organisations like Oxfam show that financially weak African states barely stand a chance of fending off economic attacks from Europe.
African governments are dependent on international loans, on the International Monetary Fund, on the World Bank, but also on the European Union's development aid. This means that in negotiations they are forced to open their markets if they want to continue receiving this money. Their arm is really being twisted, and as a result the government ends up agreeing to the abolition of import tariffs, even though it harms the country's agricultural sector, and even though it leads to more poverty and hunger.
Brussels, the political centre of Europe. 50 billion euros is distributed across the agricultural sector every year. The main recipients are France and Germany. France alone gets 10 billion. Fixed quantities, structures set in stone. Production structures are also stuck in a rut in Europe. The price is set by the retail trade and the dairy industry. Farmers and consumers are ignored and are completely at the mercy of the decision makers. This has to change, and that's what the newly founded European Milk Board wants to bring about. Its members want to produce to supply the demand. They want each country to take care of its own production, much like in Africa, except that the structures in Europe are significantly larger than those in developing countries.
It's food sovereignty for individual countries and economic regions that have to be put in the foreground, not free trade. This is a complete ideological reversal, but it's the only way. Otherwise, more is broken than can be built and hunger won't be reduced. It will get worse.
Politicians don't yet seem to have realized this. It's 2009 and the German Agriculture Minister Ilse Aigner sees no need to do anything at the European level. The problems in Germany seem far greater. There is no time to talk about the consequences of this policy for Africa. What responsibility do EU ministers have regarding the effect on threshold nations and developing countries, such as in Africa, for example?
Africa? The issue is always food for the world, which is something we will provide. But today and this week we're still discussing other topics.
The African farmers will drown in the milk floods.
I don't understand.
When the quotas are abolished.
We're more in favor of reducing or keeping the quota, and that's the stance I will be aiming for.
What are the chances of success?
We'll find out in the negotiations.
As it turned out, the chances were zero. The milk quota was increased further. Italy, Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands and Denmark were particularly in favour. But the German Minister of Agriculture is also in favour, in principle, of abolishing the quotas. She just wants it to occur more slowly to make it easier for German farmers. African problems are secondary, even though experienced political strategists such as the French Agriculture Minister Michel Barnier like to trumpet their solidarity with the Third World at such events.
I think we have to do more because the situation in many parts of the world, the famines that occurred with rising food prices last year, are intolerable. We have to give European farmers hope and prospects. We need to be self-sufficient in safe and high-quality foods. But we can't work on our common agricultural policies without being very open about what is happening in the rest of the world. We have to show solidarity, and that's what I said in the European Parliament.
We're paying a visit to the office of Via Campesina in Brussels. The international organisation represents farmers' associations from 15 countries and is very critical of EU policy. It speaks up for family businesses and against overproduction. Industrial agriculture harms both small farmers and consumers. Gérard Chauplin does not have a good word for the French minister.
Barnier hasn't understood anything. Barnier began his presidency of the Council of the European Union in Brussels in July with a conference entitled, "How Can We Feed the World?" This title alone proves he hasn't understood. He has many good intentions, but they are purely political. In a public debate, we suggested he change the title of his conference, which he didn't do, of course. But it should have been called, "How Can the World Feed Itself?"
The politicians in Brussels, on the other hand, are firmly convinced they need to help feed the world, with European goods, of course. Certain countries will be excluded from being supplied with subsidised food, but none of them are in Africa. If African countries are also forced to reduce their import duties, this will harm their agriculture. But the Agriculture Commissioner, Marianne Fischer-Boel, has a very different opinion.
I definitely do not see this problem, because of the fact that milk is a production, lots of fresh milk, lots of fresh yogurts that are traded internally within the European Union. On the cheese production, it is obvious that we have a strong interest in the new emerging countries, which could be China and India, with our high quality cheeses. But I do not see a threat for the small African milk producer in this discussion.
This policy is playing into the hands of the dairy industry. The plan is to fully liberalise the European milk market by 2015. Big companies such as Germany's Hochwald Dairy have been expanding for years. There are Hochwald plants all over southwest Germany. They even produce in France. Hochwald is a global player. The milk, which is collected in tankers, is largely made into condensed milk, butter and milk powder. Work here goes on round the clock, 7 days a week. Any remaining fresh milk is sent to other EU countries and sold to milk producers there. The director of this company, Karl-Heinz Engel, wants to increase his turnover.
Export isn't something negative for us. It's positive, because that's where we sell 35% of our production. This is an area we want to expand. Political influence is decreasing, and it will be completely gone by 2015. And we think that because of our size and our business strategy and our products, we'll be able to sell our products at sensible prices on the global market for our farmers.
Hochwald is already supplying 120 countries. They want this figure to increase. Companies in different African countries are naturally already on their customer list. If there's more milk on the European market, more can be produced, and that's good for an export-oriented company. It strains credibility to think that a plant in the middle of the German countryside is filling cans with condensed milk to ship all around the world, to countries thousands of kilometres away, to countries where local milk production has become too expensive as a result of the global market. This is trade madness. Hochwald has been around for 75 years. With an annual turnover of 840 million euros, this company is one of the big winners of EU agricultural policy. Poor countries don't stand a chance against good import products being sold at dumping prices. Nobody will need the local milk anymore. Milk production as a side business to allow families to survive will be over. The consequences are more hunger and distress, need, and more refugees on their way to Europe. That's the critics' worry.
The European agricultural policy we now have is preventing the farmers in Africa from producing food for their own people. Many are hungry. This agricultural policy has to be changed. Something also has to be done on an international level with the World Trade Organization. The rules of global trade that are being applied by the European agricultural policy also impede production. These rules encourage international dumping, and that needs to change.
The EU keeps protecting its agricultural sector from world market competition to the detriment of small-scale agriculture. Its promise to at least abolish export subsidies has been broken. The dairy industry is delighted. Overproduction creates certain turnover and profit, thanks to billions in European taxpayers' money. The politicians are reaching deep into the tax coffers at the expense of small farmers and consumers.